Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the event sponsored by the ACE Center as well as by the Department of History. My name is Dr. Nina Ha, and I'm the director of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, otherwise known as the ACE Center. The ACE is a division of the Cultural and Community Centers that also consists of the American Indian and Indigenous Community Center, the Black Cultural Center, El Centro, the Hispanic and Latinx Cultural Center, the LGBTQ+ Resource Center, and the Intercultural Engagement Center. The CCCs are under the Office for Inclusion and Diversity. The ACE's mission is to advocate for the Asian Pacific Islander Desi American communities, including Virginia Tech faculty, staff, students, and alumni. And by the way, DAISY stands for South Asians Living in the Diaspora. At the ACE, we also aim to educate the campus community on issues centered around or related to our communities. And so everyone is invited to attend all of the ACE's programs and events, and this includes people, especially now since everything is on Zoom, sort of nationally as well. So thank you everyone for attending, and I will hand it off to Dr. Brett Shadle.
Thanks, Nina. My name is Brett Shadle. I'm currently the chair of the Department of History here at Virginia Tech. And we are very happy to partner with ACE to host our guest speaker today, Dr. Judy Wu. We in the History Department believe that to understand the world in which we live and to effectively battle against the forces of repression that we face, we need to know about the struggles of our ancestors who fought against things like racism and patriarchy. We want to examine the strategies they used, the theories they created, their successes and their failures. For their stories give us inspiration, teach us lessons, and stiffen our resolve. We're particularly excited to welcome Dr. Wu and hear about her research into Patsy Takemoto Mink. And so to add to our knowledge in our ongoing fight for equality and justice. This is part of a whole series of webinars the History Department has been hosting since last summer in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. If you're interested in going back and seeing some of the previous webinars, I'll post the link to them in the chat, and I'll pass it to my colleague, Dr. Lumba.
Thank you, Brett. Before introducing Dr. Wu, I wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Tatalo Monacan people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tatalo Monacan nations and to their elders past, present, and emerging. Good evening, I guess. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Alan Lumba. I'm an assistant professor here at the Department of History, and I have the honor of introducing our featured speaker, Dr. Judy Wu. Dr. Judy Wu is a professor of Asian American Studies and the director of the Humanities Center at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Wu's expertise spans numerous fields, including Asian American, immigration, comparative racialization, women's gender and sexuality histories. The author of multiple books, Dr. Mom Chung of the Fair-Haired Bastards from University of California Press, and Radicals on the Road from Cornell University Press. Dr. Wu also co-edits a book series with Brill Press called Gendering the Trans-Pacific World, Diaspora, Empire, and Race, and is a co-editor of a major online resource, Women and Social Movements in the United States. Her current book project will be a political biography of Patsy Takemoto Mink, the subject of this evening's talk, and I just heard the great news that the manuscript was just sent off, and I think this is collaborative actually, so that's even more impressive. The title of Dr. Wu's talk tonight is Patsy Takemoto Mink, Centering Women of Color Feminism in Congress. So please virtually join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Wu.
Thank you so much for these lovely introductions. I'm so heartened to hear about the History Department's commitment to really fostering critical thinking and engagement with our contemporary times. I think we're living through some really disturbing events that are making more visible the inherent and long persistent forms of violence that have been practiced in this country. And I think we definitely need more intellectual tools and critical engagement with each other. And I just want to thank all of you for inviting me and for organizing this, especially Dr. Nina Ha. Should I go back, way, way back, at least 15 years, 15 to 16 years when we both taught at Ohio State. And she is such a wonderful collaborator, such a really warm mentor. And so I'm so happy that she's at your institution and is there playing such a positive role. I wanted to keep my remarks relatively brief since we are Zoom fatigued, but I did want to introduce you to this really fascinating woman that I've been studying for the last 8 years. And Juwon, if you don't mind, if you could go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint. And if you could just go ahead and go to the second slide. Thank you. So I think most people don't know that Patsy Mink was the first woman of color to be elected to Congress. I think many people assume Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American woman to be elected, that they think Shirley Chisholm was the first. And so part of this is a recovery project of trying to understand our past histories of women's activism, of racial activism. And I'll talk about these images in just a little bit, but just a few things about Patsy Mink. She was a namesake, or is the namesake, for Title IX. She was a co-sponsor and defender of Title IX, and after she passed away in 2002, they renamed Title IX after her. She also ran for the US presidency in 1972, the same year that Shirley Chisholm did. And so she's done something that was really remarkable in terms of her political career. I want to talk a little bit about how we might understand her life and her political contributions. And if you don't mind just advancing to the next point. So I think oftentimes when we think about women in politics, especially during the period of the 60s and 70s, which is when she was first elected to Congress, she went in 1965, left Congress in 77, went back in 1990 and passed away in office in 2002. But when we often think about that period of the 60s and 70s, there's a tendency to think about grassroots activism, right, the kind of swell of women's activism in a variety of arenas. Some of it directed towards policy, but a lot of it in terms of the daily gender dynamics that people were rethinking at that time. So that phrase, the personal is political. And for historians of that time period, there's a tendency to segment different forms of feminism. So there's liberal feminism, so women who are seeking to make changes in the political arena or in the economic arena, so they might seek equality with men. There might be more radical forms of feminism, people thinking about how gender dynamics and power hierarchies express themselves in the everyday. The women of color feminism. And so what I'm trying to do in thinking about Patsy Mink is that she's someone who really makes her mark in terms of politics, in terms of liberal feminism, so-called, but she also was a woman of color. And to really complicate the ways in which we tend to segment these different forms of feminism into distinct political traditions, as opposed to thinking about the ways in which they were being blurred. And so one term that we might think about is bridge feminism, to think about the ways in which women of color and liberal feminists were working together. Or we might think about grassroots social movements and the ways that working with elected political officials. I think this is especially important because Patsy Mink is Asian American, and the political movements of that time period in the late 60s really emphasized much more radical visions of what social justice might mean. In fact, there's a really funny encounter, or funny now, funny encounter between her and a radical activist who was interviewing Patsy Mink. And she talked about how Patsy Mink was 200% American, that she really believed that the electoral process could make a difference. And then Patsy Mink, shot back and said, well, what's the alternative, right? How do we actually create political change? So instead of thinking about that type of polarization, which did exist, I'm really thinking about the ways in which people work together. If you can go on to the next bullet point. And so I really want to critique even the idea of liberal feminism, right? To think about political change as being channeled through and contained by the law. And to really think about the ways in which people like Mink brought a very radical vision of what it meant to create a more socially just society. And maybe the mechanisms in which that change might take place was the law, but it also went beyond. And I want to cite here Sheila Sandoval's discussion of women of color feminism, that again, instead of thinking about this segmentation of feminism, to think about women of color, especially moving between different types of strategies, different forms of political consciousness, and that might be a hallmark of women of color feminism. And if you could go on to the next point. For someone like Mink, I especially want to foreground how her location in the Pacific shaped the way she thought about a variety of issues. So if you look on the map to the right, I really like to emphasize this map when I teach US history and teach US empire, to think about all those islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific that come under the purview of the United States, that it's part of an imperial project of the United States in the mid to late 19th century as it seeks to gain global ascendancy. And what's absolutely needed for that is naval power. And so each of those islands, right, Hawaii, Guam, leading to the Philippines and eventually to Asia, these are all military outposts. They're also trading posts. They're sites in which ships might refuel. And that expansion across the Pacific was so essential to the United States. In addition to expanding across the Pacific, the United States, or at least white Haole interests in places like Hawaii, are also establishing economic systems that are bringing people in. So the center picture that you see here are predominantly of Japanese immigrant women, but I think there's also some from Puerto Rico and from Portugal. These women are being imported in to help create a plantation economy. Patsy Mink grew up in a plantation society. Her family was slightly elevated compared to other plantation society members, and I can talk more about that if there's interest. But she was highly aware of the racial and labor stratification that existed within the plantation. And it was also gender stratified. So even though Japanese immigrant women were imported supposedly to create a more docile workforce among Japanese immigrant men so that they're less likely to engage in labor activism, the women themselves were not treated as domestic subjects. They were expected to work in the fields. In fact, they were paid less than the men. There was nothing like childcare, at least not organized by the plantation. These women worked until they gave birth and they came back as soon as possible. And so they had to form informal arrangements to take care of their families. But this is the type of mind frame that Patsy Mink brings with her when she goes to Washington. She's very much shaped by an advocacy for labor. She's very much interested in advocating for the rights of non-white individuals. And it's actually pretty personal for her. She was interracially married. I'm working with her daughter, Wendy Mink, who's a political scientist. And Wendy recalled that when they first moved to Washington, Loving versus Virginia had not yet been decided by the Supreme Court, and they relocated Virginia. Wendy talked about the fact that her teachers would tell her, you know, your parents are not legally married in the eyes of state law, and so you yourself are illegitimate. If you could go on to the next slide. So I want to emphasize how Mink's background as a Japanese American, as someone from Hawaii, someone who grew up in the territories before it became a state, how that really shaped the types of feminist politics that she engaged in Congress. And since we're in the midst of a Supreme Court hearing, I thought I would talk about two of her Supreme Court campaigns against Supreme Court nominees. The first one that you see here was against J. Herod Carswell, a fairly conservative nominee that was put forth by President Nixon. And Mink was the first person to testify against him before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And this is what she said, that his appointment constitutes an affront to the women of America. Pretty strong words. And I believe she was the first person to actually protest against the Supreme Court nominee based on issues of gender and patriarchy. So why did she do so? This is a quote from her statement. 4 million working mothers in this country have children under the age of 6 years. The decision of this court, which Judge Carswell sustained in effect, placed all these women outside the protection of the laws of this land. The decision stated that if another criteria of employment is added to that of the sex of the person, then it was no longer a discrimination based on sex. It ruled that Ida Phillips was not refused employment because she was a woman, but because she was a woman with preschool-age children. So hopefully you can tell from the quote, this has to do with a Supreme Court case in which Ida Phillips sues Martin Marietta Corporation. She was refused employment training not just because she was a woman, because she was a woman with preschool children, and that she sued the company based on gender discrimination. As the court case went up through the ranks, the courts decided that actually because she was discriminated on 2 counts, right, based on the fact that she was a woman and the fact that she was a mother of a young child, and that actually did not constitute gender discrimination. This is the type of thinking that scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw have heavily criticized. It was something that she talks about in a couple decades later, but this is very much at the heart of Mink's opposition to this particular candidate, to really foreground issues of motherhood along with gender and with class. If you could go ahead and open up thank you. This is another Supreme Court nominee in which Mink protested against. When Clarence Thomas, I think many people might know this history, so I'll just cover this a little bit more briefly and highlight things I think might be particularly interesting. When Clarence Thomas was nominated as a Supreme Court judge, Anita Hill, who was a law professor at that time, decided to notify the Judiciary Committee of experiences of sexual harassment by Thomas. Initially, those charges were confidential and secret. There was a perfunctory investigation that was conducted. The judiciary decided they were going to go ahead and proceed with the nomination with a Senate vote. But Anita Hill decided she was going to come out publicly, that she would raise these concerns openly. And that led to an outcry, an outpouring of concern about the ways in which the Senate was treating her allegations. At the time, there were 98 men and 2 women in the Senate. And this particular group of women are all in the House of Representatives. It was a big no-no for them to even say anything about the Senate. In fact, one of their colleagues got up in the House and made a statement about the ways in which the Senate was treating these allegations, and she was censured. So for these women who are in power heels and power suits to march the Senate was actually a pretty radical act at that time. I can go into more detail, but I just want to say that there were sort of 3 different phases in which Patsy Mink opposed Clarence Thomas. One was based on his track record. This is before the allegations became public. One was based on his track record with the Office of Civil Rights and also with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that these offices in the Department of Education and in the Civil Rights Division, they were actually crucial for enforcing civil rights allegations, for enforcing against sexual harassment. And she argued that actually under his leadership, these offices backed off on that type of federal enforcement. The second phase of her opposition really came forth when Anita Hill made her allegations public. For those who lived through that time period, who maybe have studied it, it became quite a circus. It was this kind of televised confirmation hearing. It was interesting to see the national reaction. According to one media publication, there were maybe 2 to 1 who agreed with Clarence Thomas. Some people would say, oh, I believe both of them, but would still side with Thomas. And we can talk a little bit more about that as well if you're interested. And the final aspect that I just want to say is that after this whole episode was over, after Thomas was confirmed, this particular event really sparked the emergence of the so-called third wave, which emphasized the importance of thinking about intersectionality, so thinking about race in conjunction with gender, and to help explain why there was a siding of Thomas and a dismissal of Hill. And that final phase of Mink's engagement with this confirmation hearing is that she was part of this movement to elect women to Congress. She, along with other people, were sick and tired of not being heard. And they ran in record numbers in 1992, which was called the Year of the Women at the time. If you could just go on to the next slide. I just want to end with this, and I love this image. I didn't talk about it as much in this particular talk, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. This is an image from, I think, the second term that Patsy Mink was in Congress. And this is a tradition in Hawaii. When she left to go to Washington, D.C., she was showered with leis. And this is early, maybe even the first day of her being in office during her second term. And they sent all these beautiful flowers. And I think it just really symbolizes the way in which she brought the Pacific with her to Washington, D.C. I'll just end with this article that came out this summer when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got up in Congress and denounced the sexism, the sexist treatment that she has experienced and other women have experienced. Dana Frank, who's a labor scholar, have pointed out that Patsy Mink and other women of color paved the way 50 years ago through statements like the ones that she made against Harold Carswell. So I'm going to stop here and see if we can engage in conversation.
So thank you, Dr. Wu, for just a thought-provoking talk. And I think under Dr. Wu's suggestion, we're going to try and make it more of a intimate kind of Q&A section. So we're going to actually just have all the attendees, if that's all right with the attendees. Actually, I don't know. I have to clear consent here in terms of them being also participants. So I don't know, June-won, is there a way to do that to get them started? So that, you know, we can actually have a Q&A that's not just text-based in there. But if you feel more comfortable, please feel free to put your question, any questions or comments into the Q&A section, and we can also talk about it.
I was going to suggest, Juan, if you wouldn't mind just stopping sharing the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And then I can promote people being a panelist. I think we all can. Is that okay with folks?
Sure. I mean, I don't know. I'm okay with doing it.
I can still.
I'm not very technically good at Zoom.
I just learned this trick recently.
Okay. You can do all of it at once.
I'm doing it one at a time.
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, I had a question in terms of just like a question about how you came across this project. It seems like there's a lot of very, you know, you're in contact with some of the children or the daughter of Patsy Mink, and so it's a biographical project, but obviously that means you have to have a lot of contact and a lot of interviews, perhaps. How does that, you know, first, how did you get in contact with her, and then how did that kind of relationship develop?
Yeah, I had always heard of Patsy Mink because she was so unusual, right? At the time when people are protesting, engaging in mass action, she's in Congress. So she was sort of always in the background, but as I was looking for another project, the Library of Congress was promoting the fact that it had the collection of her primary sources, her materials. And I thought, well, why hasn't anybody studied Patsy Mink? And so I think that same kind of political orientation towards political radicalism had shaped the way I had thought about that particular period. And so it really made me think about, well, how do I really think more expansively about Asian American politics and about women's politics during this time period? She has over 2,000 boxes at the Library of Congress, and I'm still not through everything. I just don't know if I can ever go through everything. But people had told me, you know, you should get in touch with her daughter. Her daughter's a political scientist. It was a very close-knit family between Patsy Mink's husband, John Mink, and her daughter, Wendy Mink. This is really a beautiful story that I learned when she passed away. Her husband would go visit her grave every day because he was just so used to talking to her. Like, it was pretty unusual for, I think, a man to support a wife to become a politician. And the fact that he's Hawai'i, he's white, supporting a Japanese American woman. I mean, they had a really, really close political and emotional bond. And the same thing is true with their daughter. She grew up, you know, talking about the Vietnam War, going to protests. There was kind of limited childcare available, which is something I sort of alluded to. And so after she would go to junior high or high school, when she moved into the Washington, D.C. area, she would just go hang out in the halls of, you know, House of Representatives and just learn about and pick up politics. So everybody said, oh, you should talk to her. And at that time, she actually still had the authority to just give people permission to look at the materials. She lives in Washington, D.C. as well. So oftentimes I would go do research at the Library of Congress, and then I stay there for a week. I see her twice a week. I would go see her in an apartment and just say, oh, this is what I found in the papers. And she would say, oh, this is what was happening in our lives. Initially, I was planning to interview her, and I did interview her quite a bit. But over time, I found out that her mother actually wanted her daughter, to write her biography. I think it was just a tricky position to be in, because she's not just a daughter, she's a political scientist. But she also didn't want to write a political science version of her mother when it's her mother. So we decided that we're going to work together. I'm writing the sort of historical narrative, historical analysis, and she's offering these personal vignettes before each chapter. They're really very powerful. And one of my favorite stories, I mean, it's kind of horrific, but one of the stories I really appreciate her sharing is that during the 1972 Democratic National Convention, there was an effort by the Democratic Party to reform itself. Like, there was that debacle in 1968 in Chicago. And so they realized that they had to, include more women, they had to include more youth voices, they had to include more people of color. And they invited her to be on some sort of committee to help host the 72 National Convention. So she ticked multiple boxes. Like, she was a woman, she was young, she was a person of color. She showed up, and the event was being held at the Playboy Hotel. Right, so just to give you a sense of the level of sexism, the kind of unthinking sexism that was in the political party. She was assigned her own, Playboy bunny to escort her around. The person would turn down the bed for her. But it's just such a powerful, powerful story, and to be able to hear that directly from her, I think makes this project even more rich.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think what it illustrates just how different the political context was, the political conditions for a politician that identifies as a woman of color. Earlier, you kind of started the talk with sort of this friction between so-called liberal feminism and radical feminism, or electoral politics and radical politics, or grassroots politics. I'm curious how you kind of approach that in your book, and you said you have your own sort of intervention in that sort of those debates.
Yeah, I think part of it is that Mink really saw herself as serving her constituents. It was interesting talking to the archivist who processed her papers at the Library of Congress, and she says that you can see in Mink's paper that it's much more hands-on. Like, you can see her handwriting. And so I'll find letters from like 4th graders saying, I'm doing a paper about civics. Will you send me some information? And she'll actually do it. She also served the part of Hawaii that was not Honolulu. So Honolulu being the fiscal capital, her district was like the outlying plantation, the villages, the outer islands. And so it was much harder to campaign in those areas, just given the geographical, kind of dispersion. But those were the people that she represented. So even if they didn't necessarily agree with her politically, they felt comfortable approaching her and saying, I have this issue that's happening to my family. Can you help in any way? So there's that sense of constituent service, that she doesn't think of electoral politics as being removed from the people, but really serving the people. So I think that's one way to think about sort of, electoral politics and the masses. I think another way to think about it is that when I trace her legislative efforts, it's almost always in partnership with social movements. So the case in which they were able to convince the Senate to take more seriously Anita Hill's allegations, the Senate aides were talking about not only the fact that these congressional women were like marching on the Senate, but also all these letters came in from people. And they said it was like the heaviest lobbying that they had seen since the Gulf War. Right, so kind of that degree of public expression of concern and outrage really shifts the political culture that's happening and kind of political dynamics within Congress. This is definitely a case when you go further back in time. So Mink had to really fight for Title IX. When Title IX was first passed, it was not that controversial. But once people realized the kind of transformative impact of the law, there were all these efforts by the NCAA, by private institutions, all these ways that they're trying to get out of Title IX regulations. And so again, it's like feminist activists lobbying Congress, following them into elevators, following them into halls, that type of political pressure, because there's just not enough women legislators at that time, right? They're just a minuscule fraction. And so how do you change the minds of people who have the power and have the authority, and maybe have a political consciousness? So I think there has to be that kind of social movement pressure for people like me to actually make a dent.
Right. Yeah, Jungwon, did you have a question?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you for the
can
presentation.
just hop in anytime. Anybody can hop in anytime, by the way.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you for the presentation. I actually was not aware very much of the role that Patsy Mink played with regards to, I mean, because we automatically talk about intersectionality, we automatically go to folks like Patricia Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw. So it was very enlightening to actually see. I was wondering, with regards to some of the historical context that you've went through for us, how might we strategize a plan of action with regards to political agency in the current moment today? I mean, for example, we are seeing sort of this insurgent movement with regards to politicians such as AOC, Ilhan Omar, and so forth. How might we learn from Congresswoman Minks?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there's multiple ways to answer it. I think one is that she really believed in the democratic process. And I think some people might think that that's naive, but she really thought that if you could state a political position and you could argue for its merits and you can convince people that that is an important position to take, that that could lead to political transformation. There's a great documentary about her called Ahead of the Majority, and that phrase comes from her senatorial run. She lost, but she was saying that you can't just sort of wait for something to be politically safe. You have to really do something that you think is morally just, and then convince people that that's the right way to approach things. And you see that over and over again in her political career. She was one of the earliest critics of the Vietnam War. And this is when a Democratic president was in office. It wasn't just when Nixon was in office. And I think she also tried to think about, well, how do we expand the political democracy? In between her terms in Congress, she went back to Hawaii and she was on city council, which I really love that political period because, you know, who goes from Congress to city council, right? But she was just so politically engaged, and it had to do with the creation of a garbage plant in her neighborhood. And she wanted to prevent that from happening. And it's a predominantly working class community. And so I think it was chosen because they were likely not to have very much political clout, right? So she really mobilized people. And she talked about how trying to maximize political participation. So I think that's one aspect. I think the other aspect that we can answer that is that she really believed in an activist, protectionist state. So she grew up in the 30s during the Great Depression. She listened to FDR on the radio. She witnessed the economic devastation of the Depression, but specifically for working people, right, on the plantations and how little power they had as laborers. And so she stood up for labor. She advocated for providing a safety net. And this is something that she advocates for in the 1990s when there's all these debates about welfare. She believed in providing healthcare. She believed in providing childcare. Right? There's all these things that really help elevate our ability to live and to live with dignity. And she advocated for those different types of programs. So another example of this is that during the welfare debates in the 1990s, it was led initially by Democrats. So President Clinton's candidacy was to really in some ways out Republicans. Like he was going to change welfare as we know it. He was going to go after crime. He was going to go after immigration, right? Really centering the white middle class. And then once Republicans came into power, you consider Republican revolution because they control both houses. They really pushed it even further. And a lot of the debates at the time were really focusing on punishing welfare mothers, and it was predominantly women of color, because of the disproportionate impact of poverty on racialization of poverty, right, and feminization of poverty. And they were saying, well, how can we instill responsibility in these individuals? So how might we cut off benefits so that they might recognize that they have to behave in a better way? And Mink's approach was really to think about, how do we get people out of poverty? Not to get people off of welfare, but how do we get people out of poverty? And what is needed for that to happen? So I think she has a very different orientation towards both the government, but also the government's role in terms of social responsibility for the American public.
Hi, I had a question. I missed the first part of your talk, so you may have gone over this, I apologize. But when you were just now mentioning her background and her interests in welfare and addressing issues of poverty and the generation in which she grew up, I was wondering about her faith background, if she was brought up in a church and if that had any influence on her way of thinking about poverty and welfare.
I don't think the church was particularly strong influence in her life. She does evoke sometimes religious language, but it's not something that's persistent. Her grandparents immigrated to Hawaii as contract laborers. So they were part of that system that was bringing in racialized workers to be in the plantations, to work the plantations. And her grandfather fled his labor contract. It was very horrible working conditions. He fled to Maui, and he fled with the woman who would become his wife. She was married to somebody else at the time. Her husband drank and physically abused her. So in some ways, they kind of rediscovered a whole new life by fleeing to Maui. And their children received the beneficial attentions of haole managers. So they would try to send their children to kind of missionary Christian schools. And these are places in which they're trying to target especially indigenous and immigrant children so that they might become assimilated, they might convert, they might adapt to sort of American ways. So that was part of her parents' background. Both her father and her mother went through that type of training. But my sense is that it was somewhat eclectic, that they would sort of take Christian practices or Western baking skills, and they would adapt it and amalgamate it with other beliefs that they had. So my sense is that they sort of practice a variety of different types of religious and cultural practices. So I'm not sure if it was so firmly rooted in a particular religious tradition.
So she herself didn't go to one of those Christian schools in Hawaii when she was growing up?
No. She went to what was called an English standard school at that time. And that was basically a form of racial segregation because you had to speak proper English to test into the school. And most of the plantation children spoke Pidgin, right? This kind of amalgamation of languages. But she went in because her parents were second generation. Most other children, I think her age tended to be, so her grandparents immigrated, so she was third generation. But most kids her age were more likely to be second generation, so they had immigrant parents. So by then she was speaking or had the ability to speak standard English to get into that. And then she also went on to public school.
And then I'll just follow up. She ended up going to college. I may have missed this when you went over it, but I was wondering about her higher education background as well.
Yeah, she's part of this generation of people in Hawaii, some of whom were able to come to the mainland for college education. So Daniel Inouye, who goes on to become this long standing senator from Hawaii, he also goes to the mainland. And this is in the aftermath of World War II. So at least for the men, right, the GI Bill provides a way for them to elevate their class standing. And it also provides the basis for political mobilization because when they come back to Hawaii after the mainland training, they become involved in the Democratic Party and creates a political revolution in that way. For Patsy Mink, what I think is really interesting is that when she goes to the mainland, she's consistently treated as an international student. So she goes to a private women's school in Pennsylvania, and they invite her to speak for a program on international students. And so she's trying to emphasize how American Hawaii is. When she goes to University of Nebraska, she's also placed in international housing. And that's, again, another form of racial segregation. She protests against it and notes that African-American students, she describes Indian students. I'm not sure if she means indigenous or she means South Asian students, right? They're all put into the same area. And when she applies to the University of Chicago Law School, it was already past the due date for application. She had her sights set on medical school, but again, it was right after World War II, and there weren't that many slots available for women. So she decided just, okay, I'll apply to law school. That seems like an interesting option. So they had not fulfilled their quota for international students yet. So they accepted her. And again, she lived in the I house. So I think that experience definitely heightens her awareness of race. It's not absent in Hawaii. Her father was questioned and imprisoned during World War II because of suspected, right, kind of fifth column activities. But being on the mainland, it just really accentuates that sense of racial difference.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Dr. Kenneth Wong. I should probably know this, but is there a continual increase over time of women of color in Congress, or was there some backlash that reduced representation?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I have the statistics to say. I know when she started, she was the first. And by the time she left, I think there were at least 4 or 5 other African-American women who were in Congress. But it's not a steady story of progress. So in 1976, which is when the United States celebrates its bicentennial, and it's also the year that Congress decides that they're going to support a national women's conference. It was the first federally funded such occasion. And it was charged with developing a national agenda on women's issues. Both Patsy Mink and Bella Abzug, who eventually headed up the National Women's Conference kind of committee, they both ran for the Senate and they both lost. And so there's various ways you can think about that, right? How much harder it is to run for the Senate compared to the House, the amount of funding that's available, the presumption that women are less likely to be winnable candidates. So I think it's more about fits and starts. So I ended my presentation with the 1992 Year of the Women, right? That the outrage over the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings really sparked women to become much more politically active. And I think you can see something very similar with I keep on to say 1998, but 2018. So you can see how kind of certain historical political moments really sort of spark political activism, electoral activism.
Judy, if I could ask what her relation, so that the picture that you have with the other women from Congress walking over to the Senate, makes me wonder what her relationship was as minority kind of interacting with white congresswomen. I mean, we think about the squad now, they're very, very much upfront about being, about race. I just wonder what her relationship was at that time.
Yeah, I think in the 1970s, there was more of a ability to cross party boundaries, and that really changes over time. So one of the first protests that Patsy Mink engages in is that the House gym will only allow women access 3 times a week from 7:30 to 9 o'clock in the morning. So she and 2 white Republican legislators decide they're going to stage a protest. And they show up because there's a class that's being advertised, and they're saying, well, we're ready to go to the class. And they brought with them a photographer. And the response was, well, this is for members only. So they stage a photograph pointing to the sign saying, well, we're members, right? And so I think there's just so few that these women are coming together when they can. And also, again, they can't just rely on the handful of people in the House. So they have to really think about how to build political bridges. So for that 1977 National Women's Conference, they received funding for it by 1 vote. So just 1 vote made the difference. And the funding was $5 million, which at the time translated to about 4 cents per woman. I think the dynamics changed a little bit in the 1990s. because Mink and other people, especially women of color, are really advocating for an intersectional form of politics. You see them coming together regardless of race on issues like women's health or women's education. But in terms of welfare and immigration, you really see the political divides. So when the welfare reform was passed, Mink, pointed out to people who were writing to her saying, you notice who voted for this, right? It was women of color in the Democratic Party. It was not the white women.
I have some questions if no one's gonna hop in.
I was actually going to ask one, actually, because
ahead.
I have some students who are aspiring politicians who will be nameless, but I was wondering, Judy, if you, as well as what you might think if you're conjuring up Patsy Mink, what sort of advice do you think you would give as students of color now who are maybe aspiring to go into politics and government, and what, given what you know, like what sort of gems or wisdoms that you can actually share with them?
I just think it's such, well, this is not particularly inspiring. I think it's so hard to campaign. And what's interesting, talking to Wendy Mink, I asked, have you ever thought about running? She's like, no, I had to campaign for my mother. Like, why would I want to go run for office? And I remember reading this article about Patsy Mink running. I can't remember, maybe it was for governor or something like that. And she had to charter a plane to visit all these outside islands. And she just had this knack to be able to go up to anybody and just start talking to them about her politics. And so she's turning to the reporter and saying, actually, I'm kind of an introvert. So I just don't know if I would necessarily even have that type of personality. But I think what I really admire about her is that she really believed in political principles and that she wanted to make political change. She was told many, many times that she doesn't have a role in politics. Her first kind of big campaign for federal office was against Anyway. This is when Hawaii just became a state. And she had wanted to run for the House of Representatives. At the time, there was only one position. There were two for the Senate. Anyway wanted to run for the Senate. But Jack Burns, who's head of the Democratic Party, came in and said, no, you guys are getting out of control. I want Anyway to run for the House. I want these two other people who are more senior to run for the Senate. And Patsy Mink, I don't want you to run. Right? So she said, well, screw you, I'm going to run because it's my political right. And she really gets clobbered. And she does not have the support of the Democratic Party. She doesn't have the support of the 442nd, right, the Japanese American Veterans Organization. Some of the labor organizations won't display her publicity. And people will explicitly say, I didn't vote for you because you're a woman, right? But even having those setbacks, she really believed that she can make a difference, and that by being at the table, she can also amplify the voices of other people who are not at the table. So I think if you're willing to do that, I want to encourage you and I'll support you. It's hard for me to imagine that type of temperament to be able to talk to so many different people about issues that are really difficult to talk about.
I mean, I think you just hit on sort of that, again, that kind of friction or tension between electoral politics and party politics, that you have to, the party decides, that was a common phrase over this electoral cycle. And she came up against that, right? That idea of there are power brokers within a two-party system. And I mean, it's interesting that she kept the faith, that she still believed that electoral politics there was good faith in there. But I think it's ultimately historically been contaminated by the two-party system. I'm curious, actually, was there any questions? I
was just going to say something, which is I think she tried to create alternative political party spaces. So when she was in Hawaii, even though the Democratic Party was just in its ascendancy at that time, it was already clear like who had power and who didn't. And so she participated in creating this kind of more younger group. They would call themselves the Everyman's Committee, and eventually became affiliated with the Young Democrats of America. So it was a space for them to come together and talk about politics without the interference of the kind of more senior people, and that they can lay out kind of political policy issues or possible reforms within the Democratic Party So I think she was trying to create those type of spaces and to ally with other people who thought similarly.
I mean, I think that's in terms of what's interesting about when she comes up, like the generation that you said. Well, one of my questions is, how does going from like a U.S. colony or U.S. Territory into statehood, how does that shape her political horizon? But secondly, how does she start to confront sort of the Hawaiian sovereign movement that starts to emerge in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and having to again sort of deal with sort of that tension between I guess electoral politics and more radical politics of decolonization.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but I described Patsy Mink having a Pacific world political sensibility. So the fact that Hawaii is almost in the middle of the Pacific, and that it had gone through this history of being colonized and had become a territory, that she has this experience and connection with other Pacific islands. So she was one of the earliest critics of nuclear testing in the Pacific. And that included the Marshall Islands, right, which are further west, as well as the Bering Strait, so the islands in the Aleutians. And that she really talked about the political and ecological connection between all these different islands. For example, Amchitka, which is where the United States detonated some of its biggest bombs, it was located on the San Andreas Fault. And it was actually considered a research advantage because they wanted to see if there was a difference between seismic activity and a nuclear blast. And so she and other people were pointing out that if a nuclear detonation triggered an earthquake, that in turn would trigger a tsunami, and that would affect very broadly, like the Pacific Islands and the Pacific coast. And so I think she really brought that awareness about being in the Pacific to Congress when she eventually ends up there. So I do talk about her efforts to deter militarism in Hawaii itself. So places like Kahualawe, which is an island kind of close to Maui, was used as bombing practice. So similar to Culebra, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, Culebra in Puerto Rico. And it's both conventional bombing, so pilots flying and dropping bombs, but it's also chemical testing. So in some of the forests in Hawaii, they were using some of the weapons that the United States was using in Vietnam. And it's the same time period, like 60s and 70s. And so she's allying with Native Hawaiian activists who are trying to reclaim Kahualawe. And it's very interesting to see how she's doing this, because she's both listening to Native Hawaiian activists and asking, what type of thing can I do politically in Congress that will enhance what you want to do? And she actually disagrees with some of them, but she feels like, okay, well, this is their land, right? I need to listen to them and see how I can support them. And if it doesn't work, then maybe we'll find some other alternatives. There's a really moving letter by these kapunas, they're elders who are trying to access Kahualawe. And they talk about how there's a deep kind of reproductive spiritual connection with the land. So they talk about how boulders are so essential for their kind of sense of life, or that they plant their placentas on Kahualawe because that's where they once lived. And they write to me and other Hawaii representatives, and they say, well, can you translate this to the Navy? Because we understand that what we're arguing for, right, the sense of the ability to be able to reconnect with this land and to reconnect with our ancestors, that's completely foreign to the Navy, which only sees this as a bombable plot, right, kind of pilot practice. So it's interesting to see her trying to translate that, and she has limited success. She's a woman speaking to Richard Nixon, trying to get him to stop testing nuclear weapons, or speaking to the military to get them to stop bombing. And what's really interesting for me is that I see this kind of the image of Sisyphus. Like every year she would write to the Defense Department or the Navy and say, we've recorded these bombing attacks, they're very dangerous. And the Navy or the military would just come back and say, oh, we're not doing that. And then they'll eventually have to admit that they actually were doing these tests. But it's just like this, brick wall that she keeps on trying to knock against. She has this great line, I think, when she says when she's much older, which is like, I've run many times, I've lost many times, but I've never lost the faith that I, as an individual, can make a difference. And she's talking about electoral politics, but I think about that when she's, writing to the Defense Department again about why they should stop bombing Hawaii.
Right. Or even just trying to get, the people not to put the trash site in your neighborhood, right? It's like, these are like these things that, these different registers that she can work within her capacities. I wasn't sure, Nina, how much time we had left in terms of taking more questions.
Maybe just one or two, and then we can call it. But I wanted to thank you again, Judy, for Dr. Wu. Sorry. Judy and I, as you mentioned in the beginning, are just really great friends. So I'm really so thankful and grateful for you for being here and sharing your book project. I'm really excited about getting my hands on it in 2022. I think one question for me is, like, you've read through so much of Patsy Mink's works. Like, what are some memorable gems from your archival work? And also, actually, I have another student, a few other students who actually do archival work. So I was just wondering what your process was for your research as well, because I think that would be interesting for students to know how you do your work as well.
Yeah, I love primary sources. So I think most people know what they are, but sources from that time period, or they might be oral histories that are recollections in that time period. I'm starting my next book project right now, and it's about the Asian American and Pacific Islander women who attended the 1977 National Women's Conference. Mink helped advocate for its funding, so it's sort of an offshoot of this particular book project. And I was just reading the 1977 Guam Women's Conference booklet. And at least according to the authors, like, this is the first time that women in Guam came together and had a chance to talk about women's issues. And then they're also trying to put together a publication that will be then sent to the national conference. So it's a way for them to represent their island to the nation. And it's just interesting, the types of issues that they're exploring. So what is Chamorro identity, especially given the long histories of imperial occupation in Guam, right? With the Spanish, with Japan, with the United States. How does that impact multiraciality? What does it mean to be kind of a modern Guamanian woman? So I love, primary sources like that. It just really takes me back in time and place. Some finds. So one of my favorite stories by Patsy Mink is that when she's on city council, a Republican mayor is elected. He was actually a former Democrat, but he decided he's going to convert to Republicanism. And there had been some more conservative Democrats, so they decided they were going to convert with him. And they made a very public announcement that, now the city council is dominated by Republicans, and we're just going to take away all the power from Democrats. So she was on a flight to San Francisco, heard about this, got back on the plane and got back, and decided she was going to recall those former Democrats. This is unusual. I mean, it was really unprecedented. But she argued that if people made this switch before an election, that's another thing. But if you're elected as a Democrat and you decide you're going to change political parties, then people in the constituency have the right to make a decision about whether you should stay in office. And all three of them were eventually voted out. It was a messy race, so it also cost her politically. The Democratic Party was supportive of this too, because this is when Ronald Reagan was in office, and so there's that phenomenon of Democratic Republicans, right? Democrats who convert to Republicanism. So this became a trend in Hawaii, that the Democratic Party there would lose its control as well, potentially. But after this whole thing happened, one of her constituents wrote and said, Patsy Mink, she don't take shit, right? Like, she was going to be willing to fight, no matter what it took. And actually, David Farber, who's a historian, used to be one of her aides. And he said that she was always very brusque. Like, she was always busy. And if you watch that documentary, her aides said that, she would mark certain plot tags as urgent, but almost every single thing was urgent. Like, there was just so much that she wanted to do. And he recalled that she just sort of turned to him one time and said, "Oh, you did a really good job on that, one particular issue." But he was just sort of taken aback because she's always so kind of businesslike and she wants to kind of get things done. So I think those things are really kind of entertaining and amusing to me.
Thank you. That's maybe one last question. So is your book being co-written with Wendy Mink, or is it just interviewing with her?
She has a vignette that opens each chapter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what it's like to collaborate on like a book together with someone.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate her proofreading and catching things. She's a political scientist and I'm just a historian studying politics. So I think she understands some of the more nuances of the political process and also she lived through it. But we have had some differences of opinion as well, and that we've had to negotiate about how to understand certain aspects of her mother's life. And sometimes we just sort of let it sit on the paper, and then other times we kind of have to negotiate with each other and figure out, okay, what's the best way to present that. So in the introduction, I don't know, maybe the publisher will want us to change it, but I talk about it as sort of a duet of voices, right? That you're going to have different perspectives. We're not going to cover everything the same way, or we're not even going to cover the same events necessarily, but that you'll get two different views of this woman.
Thank you. I guess I'm going to say thank you on behalf of everyone. Alan, do you have any last words or comments before we close it for today?
No, just thank you, Dr. Wu. Just appreciate, it's just a very timely talk for this moment. And it's actually quite inspiring, I think, especially during these times of sort of alienation from this large system. And I think it's really also thought-provoking about what you can do on a day-to-day. Also thank Nina, Dr. Nina Ha, Dr. Brett Shadle, soon to be Dr. Jung-Won Kim, everybody here. Yeah, that's all I wanted. I just appreciate everybody being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing and inviting me. I really enjoyed the opportunity. So I've been telling everybody to register to vote. And if you haven't responded to the census, please respond to the census. It's so important. I just found out that even water allocation is based on the census, not to mention a political apportionment, but just like some very basic day-to-day services that we rely upon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank you.
day, everybody. Thanks. Bye.